This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to come and talk here. This is a relatively new piece of research work for me. The theme isn't new at all. For almost 10 years now, I've been studying the history or the histories of the relationship between the Mapuche and the Chilean state, and I recently published a book on the subject. But it's the period under scrutiny which is new to me. So in the book, which is called The Mapuche and Modern Chile, A Cultural History, I trace Chilean-Mapuche relations from the occupation or the so-called pacification campaigns of the late 19th century, so when the Mapuche people and their territory were first incorporated into the Chilean state, through to the bicentenary of independence, of Chilean independence in 2010. So until now, I've done very little research on the first half of the 19th century. So one of the first things I wanted to do in the paper today was explain why I've chosen to move back further in time to the early independence era, and then in the course of the paper or at the end of the paper, hopefully clarify what this adds to my previous studies. I also want to show how post-independent Chile differed from other countries in Latin America vis-a-vis their indigenous populations, and to show you a couple of sources that I think are particularly illuminating. Okay, so last year I was invited to participate in a project that specifically focused on the 1820s in Chile, a project that's led by the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez in Santiago and funded by the Chilean government agency CONACYT. Now, the aim of the project is to open up new debates on post-independent Chile. And there's 8 of us in total involved, from Bristol, from Oxford, from Santiago, and from Bogota. And we draw on a variety of hitherto underexplored case studies, I'd say, in order to challenge what we see as the 4 major limitations of most, or at least some of the existing historiography on early 19th century Chile. First, we explore the opportunities and possibilities of the period, as well as the well-documented difficulties and problems. The 1820s, we argue, was not merely a decade of anarchy and disorder. It was also a time of fruitful experiments. Just because the experiments were not successful in the long term, federalism, regionalism, for example, doesn't mean that they were necessarily doomed to failure from the outset. Second, we affirm that the decade is worth studying in its own right, not simply or not just as the end of something or the transition to something else, the wars of independence and the Portalian regime, respectively. Third, we investigate political practices as well as ideas, and when studying the latter, when studying ideas, namely liberalism and republicanism, we focus very much on their adaptation and moulding to local circumstances. And finally, the project aims to go beyond the nation-state approach that is so prominent in many scholarly works on the post-independence era, by drawing out and analysing not only the continental and global dimensions of the Republican project in Chile, but also its internal regional permutations. So what I want to show in my contribution to the project is that the Mapuche participated actively in the experiments and the struggles of the late 1810s and 1820s, and that they did so as a collective, but as a diverse collective made up of many different and sometimes opposing political actors. What I also want to show is that the difficulties of the time for the fledgling Republican state, the lack of economic and military resources, for example, and the political divisions and rivalries, particularly between Santiago and Concepcion in the south, these provided an important window of opportunity for the Mapuche. So what's a difficulty for one sector is an opportunity for someone else. So this period, I argue, was a time when the Mapuche could make their voices heard and influence political developments. They made their voices heard afterwards too. They've always made their voices heard in Chile, but from the second half of the 19th century they were in less of a position to be able to influence decision making. Okay, so a study, also one other point, a study of Mapuche involvement in the debates of this time, the debates of the 1820s, also helps us to go beyond the nation state. Building on existing works by Jorge Pinto, Holdensis Casanova, Pablo Mariman in Chile, I assert that the Mapuche obliged some Chilean independence leaders to imagine a very different kind of state to the centralised, exclusionary model that emerged in the 1830s, and particularly from the 1850s, 1860s onwards. Both Bernardo O'Higgins and Ramon Freire were forced to engage with the idea of Chile as a shared social space, which included, without assimilating, indigenous peoples, indigenous cultures. And it's difficult to believe now, given the way in which the Chilean government functions in relation to the regions, and also given the very heated debates about the constitutional recognition of indigenous peoples. But at this time, in the late 1810s, in the 1820s, it was possible to envisage multiple regional power bases working together. So I'm thinking here of Coquimbo in the north, Santiago, Concepcion, and Mapuche territory. It was possible to think of those four working together. It was even feasible to think of Chile as a plurinational territory. So at this point in the paper, it's worth underlining the fact that the situation of the Mapuche in the 1810s and 1820s was relatively unique among Latin America's indigenous peoples and very different to the situation of the Mapuche from the late 19th century onwards. So famously, they were one of the only indigenous peoples, as everyone knows, to successfully defeat the Spanish conquistadores on the battlefield, and they maintained their political and territorial independence throughout the colonial period. This was formally recognised in successive treaties signed between Mapuche leaders and representatives of the Spanish crown. I think there were 17 such treaties between 1641 and 1803. The Mapuche was still an independent people at the time of the independence wars, and they participated in the armed conflict as such. Some sided with the royalist forces, largely as a result of the treaties that they'd signed with the Spanish crown. Others sided with the patriotas. Some swapped sides during the conflict. Some pledged support to both sides at the same time. Now, although the constitutions of 1823 onwards in Chile included Mapuche lands within the territorial demarcation of the Chilean state, so from the Andes in the east to the Pacific in the west, from the Atacama in the north to Cape Horn in the south, Mapuche autonomy and the fact that they were very much in control of the lands south of the Biobío River, and that this river served as a natural frontier between the two nations, that was actually, despite what was said in the constitution, that was recognised, that Mapuche autonomy was recognised in numerous other official documents of the time, not least the treaties of Yumbel of 1823 and Tapiwe of 1825. These two treaties were signed between the commander-in-chief of the Chilean forces stationed in the frontier zone, so near and around Concepcion, Pedro Barnechea, and the Mapuche Lonco, the Mapuche cacique, or Mapuche chief, Francisco Mariluán. And so this people and their relationship with the Chilean state in the 1820s do not fully fit into a continental history of internal colonialism. The Mapuche were not yet colonized subjects, they were not yet subalterns. So the basic starting point for my work therefore differs to that of most of the recent scholarship on indigenous peoples and their participation in the construction of Latin America's newly independent nation states. I'm thinking here, for example, since the 90s, of Peter Guardino's work on Guerrero in Mexico, of Charles Walker's work on Cusco in Peru, Cecilia Mendez on the Huanta Rebellion in Peru, Marcela Echeverri on Pasto in Colombia. All these excellent historical studies helpfully show us how indigenous groups bargained and compromised with, as well as resisted and rebelled against the elites who were directing the state-making projects. They show us how indigenous peoples appropriated and subverted the discourses of liberalism and republicanism, and also sometimes Hispanic colonial discourses too. No, they show us how indigenous actions at this time were best understood as practical, strategic, political consciousness, as opposed to idealism, naivety, or ignorance. So clearly, this is what we see with the Mapuche during the independence wars too, as they bartered with the royalist and patriot forces, and then later as they interacted with the new Chilean Republic. The difference is that the Mapuche did this not as a colonized sector of society, not as part of the peasantry, not as part of the impoverished peasantry, but as an independent people with their own territory, a territory that had been officially acknowledged as their own. And some Mapuche caciques owned vast tracts of land and were wealthy, or at least as wealthy, as their counterparts in Criollo Chilean society. Thus, issues such as paying tribute or paying an Indian head tax, which affected so many other indigenous peoples in post-independent Latin America, were not so relevant to the Mapuche. This was not something that they had to deal with, or at least most of them. This was not something most of the Mapuche had to deal with, because of course north of the Biobío River, they were subjected to the laws of the Chilean state, as they had been to the Spanish colonial state beforehand. That the Mapuche were recognized as autonomous neighbors comes across loud and clear in an address by O'Higgins to nuestros hermanos, los habitantes de la frontera del sur. That was the title of his address. This was published in the Gaceta Ministerial de Chile on the 13th of March 1918, and very recently it's been used by Mapuche organizations when making their case to the United Nations for their political and territorial rights. So here, in this slide, I quote from the last paragraph. Araucanos, os habla el jefe de un pueblo libre y soberano, que reconoce vuestra independencia y que está pronto a ratificar ese reconocimiento por un acto público y solemne, firmando al mismo tiempo la gran carta de nuestra alianza, para presentarla al mundo como el muro inexpugnable de la libertad de nuestros estados. Contéstame por el conducto del gobernador intendente de Concepción, a quien he encargado trate este interesante negocio, y me avise de vuestra disposición para dar principio a las negociaciones. I think some of the terms here, some of the terms that O'Higgins uses are very interesting. Our alliance, our states in the plural, our brothers, as he addresses them in the title of the address. So Chile, like other fledgling republics in Spanish America, is imaged as one big family, if you like. But O'Higgins is forced to recognize the Mapuche as brothers, and therefore you could say as equals, rather than invoking a kind of father-son type relationship. The other key term here is, of course, I think negotiation. O'Higgins needed to win the Mapuche over to his cause. He needed to legitimize the Republican project at a time when La Guerra a Muerte, with Benavides and his followers, was raging in the south. He needed Mapuche support. O'Higgins needed Mapuche support in order to have a chance of defeating the royalist forces in the south. Now, we already know from existing scholarship on Chile that many Mapuche leaders did agree to enter into negotiations with the newly created Republican state, as O'Higgins requested. The aim of my research project is to explore further some of the intricacies and intimacies of the processes involved in these negotiations. And I hope to add some more detail to the existing picture by revisiting previously cited or reproduced primary sources such as Mapuche letters to Chilean authorities, the speeches of figures like O'Higgins, congressional reports and government correspondence, but also by incorporating some new or largely undertapped sources, including British and French consular reports, memoirs of British military officers who travelled to Chile during the 1810s and 1820s, and also foreign and national newspapers. And in this detail of the negotiations, which were both oral and written at the time, I seek to include as many Mapuche perspectives as possible. Several sources allow us to get at their voices, or to try to get at their voices. We have, like I said, we have access to a number of letters that are authored by Mapuche caciques during the early 19th century. We also have access to some late 19th century testimonies by Mapuche elders who, through the memories of their grandparents' memories and stories, take us back to the post-independence period. And finally, we have the reported speech contained in some travel accounts and some consular correspondence. And clearly that this isn't the same as direct Mapuche voice, no? And in all these sources, in fact, the Mapuche voice is mediated by others, by the scribes of the letters, by the ethno-linguists who are compiling and editing these the collections of testimonies, and by observers who are paraphrasing what is said. But they're helpful, nonetheless. Now, in doing this, I hope to expand the important work of historians such as Jorge Pinto and Paulo Mariman in Chile, who largely focus on what the negotiations tell us about the Chilean elites and their willingness to establish a shared social space with the Mapuche. In the opening chapter of his book, Desde la inclusión a la exclusión, Pinto tells us that he explores the first effects of the nation and state building processes on the indigenous world, and he concludes that these were few and minor, given that until the 1850s, and here I quote again, Araucanía continued to function as it had done for most of the colonial period. Now, I agree with this assessment to a large extent, although I do think we see increased state intrusions into the region, into Mapuche territory from the 1820s, and often in open defiance of the official pledges of non-interference. But what I want to tease out of the documents is not so much how Chilean state building affected the Mapuche, but how the Mapuche affected Chilean state building. So it's not really a different argument, but maybe just a shift in emphasis. Okay, so one of the mechanisms of political interaction that I'm particularly interested in is the parlamento. A formal meeting between leaders of the patriot forces and later on leaders and representatives of the Chilean Republican state and Mapuche caciques, which would often be followed by the signing of an official treaty. Now, the Parlamento was a legacy of the colonial period. There'd been 47 parliaments or parlamentos held between the Spanish representatives of the Spanish crown and the Mapuche between 1597 and 1803. And to my knowledge, this didn't take place, but people may well correct me, or at least it didn't take place in the same format or have the same kind of significance elsewhere in the Andes. And going back to my previous point about Mapuche affecting state building, I mean, you could say that the Mapuche obliged the Chilean Republican state to continue with these colonial practices, these colonial procedures. Luckily, we have access to a great variety of very rich primary material from the period, which allows us to glimpse what was going on in these parlamentos. For example, this wonderfully detailed account of a meeting between the Mapuche Pehuenche or the Pehuenche Mapuche, the Pehuenches, a group of the Mapuche, a meeting between the Pehuenche and General San Martin in 1816, which is provided by General Miller in his memoirs of his travels to Argentina, Chile, and Peru. Memoirs that were published in London in 1828 and acclaimed in the national press shortly afterwards. Now, interestingly, what I quote here is almost exactly what the Morning Post of the 12th of December 1878 reproduced for its readers in this country, because its editors said the passage was original and extremely curious. Now, I'm going to quote it from it at length here, and then I'll refer to a couple of other kind of complementary primary sources from the period to discuss what I think are the most significant features of Miller's narrative. And of course, it's one narrative, and it's his interpretation of what was happening. Okay, on the day before that fixed upon for an interview with the Indians, General San Martin caused to be sent to the fort of San Carlos 120 goat skins of aguardiente or grape brandy, 300 skins of wine, a great number of bridles, spurs, all of the old embroidered or lace dresses that could be collected in the province, hats, handkerchiefs of an ordinary kind, glass beads, dried fruits, etc., etc., for presents as an indispensable preliminary to success in any Indian negotiation. The palaver, as he referred to it, then commenced in the Place d'Armes, where the governor of the fort had provided a table covered with the cloth of the chapel pulpit and the benches for the caciques and war captains, who were the only persons admitted to conference with the general. The Indians outside remained formed and mounted, keeping themselves on the alert until the result should be made known. Upon arriving at the Place d'Armes, the chief took their seats according to seniority, the caciques first and then the war captains. General San Martin, the governor of the fort, and the interpreter placed themselves on a bench at the head of a table. According to Miller, the general, as matter of courtesy, proposed a friendly glass previous to proceeding to business, but all declined, assigning as a reason that if they drank, their heads could not be firm to give proper consideration to the matter they assembled to discuss. The interpreter, Father Julian, a Franciscan friar, an Araucanian by birth and brought up by a Creole family from the age of 10, then commenced a harangue. He reminded them of the good understanding which had subsisted between Pehuenche Indians and the general-in-chief, who relied with confidence upon the continuation of the harmony so happily established, and who convened them in a solemn palaver to compliment them with drink offerings and gifts, and to request that the patriot army might be permitted to pass through Pehuenche territory. The interpreter then moves on at this point, according to Miller, to denounce the Spanish as heinous foreigners who only sought to rob the Pehuenche of their lands, their cattle, their wives and their children. We're then told, and here I quote directly again, a dead silence followed. Those painted savages, wrapped up in profound meditation for a quarter of an hour, prescribed a picture truly striking. At length, the senior cacique named Ninconyancu broke silence. He was nearly 80 years of age, his hair was snow white, and his appearance venerable in the extreme. Ninconyancu, at this point we're told, asked the other caciques what they thought of the proposals made by the Christians, they were referred to, and in the words of Miller, the debate which followed was carried on in a manner exceedingly interesting. Each chief in his proper turn declared his sentiments with the utmost tranquillity and without the slightest interruption or sign of impatience from the rest. Once these discussions were over, Ninconyancu reportedly told San Martin that the majority of chiefs agreed with the proposals. After this, they embraced San Martin and they gave him some mantas, or ponchos, which had been made by their wives. San Martin, in return, gave the Mapuche caciques numerous presents. And again, in the words of Miller, what the Indians appeared to prize most highly of the gifts they received were the hats and the embroidered or lace dresses which were put on and worn in the instant these articles came into their possession. There are several things that struck me about Miller's account when I first read it. mainly the importance of ceremony and ritual. The hospitality, the drink offering, the patriots' forces provisions of large quantities of wine, aguardiente, the giving of the presents, the seating arrangements, the role of the interpreter, the form that the discussions took, who's allowed to talk first, and so forth. Clearly, this is a performance. It's a spectacle which is both constitutive of and constituted by dominant social relations. San Martin, he's obliged, if you like, to submit to the formality and the protocol demanded by the Pehuenche, because he's asking for their permission to pass through their territory, to be able to attack the royalist forces by surprise from the south. It's San Martin who wants to hold the meeting, but it's the Pehuenche who lay out exactly what's needed for the meeting and the way in which the meeting will proceed. As Miller said, it is an Indian negotiation. And the patriots, they have to comply and they have to pay for it. We see this also in the letters between Mapuche leaders and Chilean state authorities later on in the 1820s, in the build-up and the aftermath, in the build-up to and the aftermath of the major parlamentos of Yumbel, which I mentioned before, of 1823, and Tapihue of 1825. In correspondence with military officials and regional governors, the Mapuche caciques go into great detail about the provisions that are required in order to wine and dine their troops. Provisions that are essential, they say, if the Chileans want to demonstrate their love and their peaceful intent towards the Mapuche. These are exact quotes from two different letters from Francisco Mariluán in 1823 and 1825, respectively. Now, in the Treaty of Tapihue, which was signed at the Parlamento of Tapihue in January 1825 between, as I've already said, Chilean commander Pedro Barnechea and the Mapuche cacique Francisco Mariluán, Article 28 of that treaty specifically states that the Chilean authorities wanted to forego in the future all the agasajos traditionally associated with these official encounters. But this was not possible because Mariluán was adamant that such traditions should continue. The giving of gifts is also very interesting. According to Miller, this is essential to the success of the negotiations. He refers to it as an indispensable preliminary. I'd say in some ways it's more than a preliminary, it's actually part of the negotiations themselves. The two sides, you could say, communicate through the gifts. It's important here that there's an exchange of gifts. San Martin gives all sorts of things to the Mapuche: horse riding gear, dresses, handkerchiefs, beads, and he receives mantas made by the caciques' wives in return. So, modern luxuries, you could say, probably made in Europe, are swapped for traditionally crafted Mapuche weavings. They're of equal symbolic value. In another account of a meeting between the Mapuche chief Venancio Conyepan and Chilean authorities in Talcahuano in the early 1820s, British military officer Richard Vowell, his memoirs, the title is Campaigns and Cruises, he claims that the Mapuche viewed the presents they received as a kind of tribute. Chilean authorities were bound by obligation to give the Mapuche presents. The Mapuche expected presents, and on this occasion in Talcahuano, the Richard Vowell's present, they don't give any presents in return. Now, according to Vowell, Conyepan's men received the presents, received the gifts with disdain and a manifest lack of interest, despite their value. And he was told by the interpreter that this was normal. It was a way, the interpreter said, of demonstrating their independence. It was a way of impressing on foreigners that the Mapuche were a wealthy nation. As with the provisions of food and wine, the letters that were sent by Mapuche chiefs to Chilean state representatives show us that they were very precise in their gift requests. In one message to the Intendente of Concepcion, Juan de Dios Rivera, dated the 5th of March 1824, Francisco Mariluán asked specifically for un sombrerito de huli con una buena franja y una chupita. And 2 years later, the same Mariluán writes to the Chilean captain Juan de Dios Luna, telling him that his brother didn't like the hat that he'd recently been sent because it was uncomfortable, and then could it please be changed for a round hat, again from uli, and as soon as possible. So that the government authorities acted upon such requests, and we can see that they did in following letters where they're thanked for the gifts that they sent, points to the perceived authority and the importance of individual figures like Mariluán, and that they needed to court these figures. No? Government documents and newspapers from the time also confirm the significance of the agasajos, the hospitality, the pomp and the splendour of the welcome offered to the Mapuche leaders. And they also confirm the significance of the gift giving in that they confirm the large amount of money that was spent on them. So some of the expenses had to be approved by Congress. So, for example, on the 17th of November 1824, when Ramon Freire was about to head south to hold un parlamento con los araucanos, I'm presuming that that's the Parlamento of Tapiwe, which was eventually held in January 1825, and which Freire doesn't actually end up being present at. But anyway, at this point, the government asked Congress to endorse a subsidy of 100,000 pesos. I don't know how much 100,000 pesos at this time represented, but to put it in some kind of perspective, just shortly beforehand, the newspaper El Tizón Republicano lamented how poorly resourced and poorly dressed the army troops in Concepcion, so in the frontier, how poorly resourced they were, and affirmed that an investment of 100,000 pesos would make all the difference. So, you know, in some, the drink offering and the gift giving, this was something that the Chilean state took seriously and had to spend a significant amount of money on, and it constituted an important part of official diplomatic business with the Mapuche. Okay, there were just two other things that I'd like to highlight about General Miller's account of the Parlamento, and then I want to move on to one other source and then to conclude. Okay, firstly, the large number of Mapuche who are present at the Parlamento, no? The Mapuche who are armed and who are on horseback, and they don't dismount or hand over their weapons until an agreement has been reached, and then the celebrations, the festivities begin. So they're showing San Martin that they're a force to be reckoned with, not duped or manipulated. Significantly, right at the end of Miller's description of the festivities that followed the kind of somber political discussions, he tells the reader that despite San Martin submitting to the Pehuenche demands, the Pehuenche did not actually comply with their part of the agreement, and shortly afterwards they informed royalist forces of San Martin's plans to attack from the south. So, narrated thus then, you know, the Parlamento is far from a tool of colonial domination, no? Either during the colonial period, and Payas, Samaniego and Zavala have worked on the colonial period, but also during the early independence era. It wasn't something that was imposed on the Mapuche. Sometimes the Mapuche themselves requested a Parlamento. According to French consular correspondence, this is what happened in 1823 with the Parliament and subsequent Treaty of Yumbel. Other times they had to be cajoled into attending Los Parlamentos. Correspondence of January 1824 between authorities stationed in the frontier zone and the Ministry of War in Santiago includes complaints of how difficult it is to actually get the Mapuche to agree on a date and a place for a forthcoming Parlamento. My other and final point is that this form of political interaction seemed to privilege Mapuche discourse and Mapuche language. The discussions follow Mapuche tradition. According to Miller, each of the Mapuche chiefs is allowed to speak for as long as they want without interruption. And they do so, and this is the most important thing I think, they do so in Mapuzungun, no? So hence the need for interpreters. The onus is on the patriot forces here, and then later the Republican state, to get the Mapuzungun translated into Spanish, rather than the Mapuche to get the discussions in Spanish translated into Mapuzungun. In Richard Vowell's account that I've already mentioned of the meeting between Venancio Cognapan and Chilean authorities in Talcahuano, there's an interpreter there, despite the fact that Cognapan and his sons can speak Spanish fluently. We know that. So in this public representation of Mapuche-Chilean relations in the frontier zone, the official language is Mapuzungun. And we know, for example, from Mary Graham's very famous account of her time in Chile, that Bernardo O'Higgins was fluent in Mapuzungun and could speak Mapuzungun and was willing to speak Mapuzungun with the Mapuche. So Mapuzungun at this point has not yet been suppressed under the banner of the Chilean nation. Notably, the Chilean state authorities, as with the Spanish colonial authorities before them, are obliged to pay for the interpreter, as they pay for everything else. But it seems, from the accounts of Miller, the accounts of Vowell, from letters from Mapuche caciques detailing the arrangements for these parlamentos, it seems that it's the Mapuche chiefs who choose the people who are most suitable for the job. And here, in this palabra with San Martin, it's a Mapuche friar, who'd lived with a Criollo family since the age of 10. He's an intercultural agent, if you like. He has experience of both societies, but he began life in Mapuche society and is speaking on their behalf here. Okay, so what does all of this mean? Reflecting on Freire's government in particular, the Mapuche historian Pablo Mariman, who I've already referred to, he asks, was the Republican Parlamento a sincere and profound recognition of the Mapuche nation, the existence of a Mapuche nation, or was it instead a political strategy, a way of gaining time, a way of maintaining peace, but all the while preparing oneself in order to attack and eventually conquer that other nation? Pablo Mariman asked the question. He doesn't answer it. It's obviously very difficult to answer. It's interesting in this regard that in one letter to the Minister of War, Pedro Barnechea, who is the Chilean commander who held 2 parlamentos with Francisco Mariluán, it's interesting, he asks for money to buy presents, to buy gifts for the Mapuche, but he specifically justifies it, the expense, by saying that it's a cheaper way of conquering Mapuche territory than military conflict is. So, maybe conquest was always on the agenda. It's difficult to know, but I think we need to be wary of presuming, and again, coming back to, was it just a transitional decade to something else? We maybe need to be wary about presuming that it was, that military conquest was inevitable. What we do know is that there were no parlamentos held between the Mapuche and the Chilean state after the Chilean state definitively occupies Mapuche territory in the late 19th century. There were gatherings, yes, there were meetings, yes, but not of such consequence, not of such formality, not that ended up in any treaties, and not in which the Mapuche dictated the procedures. Okay, this is one final source that I wanted to show you. Thanks to Chilean historian Jorge Paves, we have access to 38 letters authored by Mapuche leaders during the 1810s and the 1820s. 9 of these 38 letters in his collection are written to Chilean state authorities. The others are to Argentine state, or not Argentine at the time, but the authorities of Rio de la Plata. And this is one of the letters to the Chilean authorities from Francisco Marileo. It's to the Intendente of Concepcion, Juan de Dios Rivera, dated as you can see there, the 26th of September 1827. Now, quite possibly, or even probably, Marileo did not write the letter himself. As Paves explains in his introduction to the letters, Mapuche leaders at the time often pronounced their message out loud in Mapuzungun. Their words were then translated into Spanish by lenguaras, and then they're written down by a scribe or a secretario. So that's, writing is right from the beginning then a collective process. The collectivization of that process becomes even more apparent in the public reading of the letters before they're sent, because at this stage, not only the sender of the letter and the lenguaras and the secretario, not only they are involved, but potentially other members of the community can also be involved in contributing to the message that's going to be sent. Issues of authorship apart, though, I'm really interested in the fact that the Mapuche were not only participating in the struggles and experiments of the early independence period, but they're also actively involved in writing the histories of those struggles and experiments. So what does Marileo say in the letter? El 24 del corriente ha sido remitido mi hermano José Pinchumán, cacique principal de los 4 Butolmapu, the 4 regions of Mapuche territory que componen la tierra, el cual ha pasado para la plaza de Yumbel amarrado y custodiado reo por el comandante que asiste en esta plaza de nacimiento, conduciéndolo a pie con la custodia de 4 dragones y un teniente de caballería. Jamás he visto eso, señor. Varios comandantes desde que Dios me dio las luces han comandado dicha plaza y jamás han guiado de semejante desacato. So Yumbel, Nacimiento, they are just above the frontier. They're just above the Biobío river. So they are in Chilean territory, but where many Mapuche live. Al considerar semejante hecho, que en vez que los gobiernos nos deben de dar un crédito, nos desacreditan y nos deshonran. Ya somos desengañados de mi amada patria. It's underlined in the letters that Paves publishes. Pues nos pone unos hombres a que nos mande que son de tan poco conocimiento y que no hay como decir. Solo nos valdremos de nuestras armas para ver modo de poner en salvación a nuestro Padre, que es el que nos da consejos todos los días y que se le pague tan buenos servicios a nuestras madre patria y les pague con tan semejante desaire. Todo eso nace de la gran mudanza de comandantes, poniéndolos de toda clase, pues este comando debe ser perpetuo por los hombres hijos del país que tuviesen un conocimiento de esta nación natural, como lo ha sido el mayor Salazar, Luis Salazar, que en el tiempo que él mandó jamás recibimos el desaire que hoy sufrimos y gran sentimiento que lloramos. Okay, so here, Marileo, he's complaining about the arrest and the punishment of Cacique Pichumán by the commander of Nacimiento and Yumbel, like I said, north of the frontier. He is prepared, to make recourse to arms. He's prepared to use violence to try to save Pichumán. He uses this particular episode, to denounce Chilean government policy more broadly, that being the Gran Mudanza of new commanders to the area who don't know the frontier zone, he's saying, who don't have knowledge of this people, this nation. Now, for me here, and other people may disagree, so I'll be interested to know what you think. For me, the amada patria and the madre patria, that is Chile here. he relates to it and feels part of it, but also he and his people feel very disillusioned and let down by it. Now, I'm not sure how important, the terms patria and nación, I guess I'm still trying to get to grips with it. I mean, they're so fluid, they're so flexible. Different people use them in different ways. The same person sometimes uses the same person sometimes uses the same term in different ways. Patria, nation, Venancio Cognepan, in one of his letters to Bernardo Higgins, refers to el Estado Araucano. And sometimes the patria, so here I think it is a reference to Chile, but sometimes the patria that they talk about are very local patrias. It could be Lumaco or Tirua. But what does come across very clearly, I think, here is the importance of personal relationships. So here, Marileo, he had a good relationship with Luis Salazar. At that point, the broader relationship, if you like, between the Chilean and Mapuche worked well. The Mariluán had a good relationship with Pedro Barnechea and also with General Borgoño. Venancio Cognepan had a good relationship with Bernardo O'Higgins. But a lot seems to depend on these very personal relationships. And when those personal relationships break down, I think you can also see that the broader negotiations also break down. Okay, so to conclude, so the dialogue, the celebration of alliances and pacts, the gift giving, the letter writing, at this point it is interspersed already, with episodes of hostility and treachery and violence. So the threat and the actual use of violence was there. That violence increases as the century progresses, but at this point it doesn't seem to be the dominant story. Second point, the Mapuche pressured Chilean government and military authorities into engaging with an inclusive vision of the Chilean state, a state that was accepting of difference, because at this stage it had to be, or at least it had to be seen to be. It was temporary. It was possibly, in the case of certain figures, maybe superficial. But I think it's still worth investigating the details or the articulations of this alternative way of imagining the Chilean state. In some ways, it's a kind of a what-if history. Florencia Malón talks about this in her article in the book that you edited on the formation of the nation state, her article, The Parchments of the Nation State. I mean, she asks, what if the Mapuche had managed to broker a lasting agreement with regional authorities in Concepcion? And what if those regional authorities had managed to force the authorities in Santiago to adopt a more federalist system of government? That this didn't end up happening doesn't mean it's not worth looking back into the way in which it may be or it nearly happened to understand the period better. No. And lastly, so what does this add to my previous studies? So my book is a long-term analysis of Mapuche cultural and intellectual production and of the Chilean state's cultural policies. And it elucidates, I hope, the realities of a highly complex and constantly shifting relationship in which Mapuche actors and the state very much end up embedded in each other. And it shows that the history of Chilean-Mapuche relations since the conquest and occupation of Mapuche territory has never been one simply of repression and resistance, but rather, multiple creative negotiations. If we move back to the early 19th century, obviously the context is very different. The Mapuche were not a colonized people at this point. They could be enemies or they could be friends of the state, but they were not subjects of the Chilean state. They were not yet subjects of the Chilean state. By the late 19th century, they were. Okay, so the context is very different. The forms of negotiation were different. So in the early 19th century, you have the parlamentos, gift-giving, discussions in Mapuzungun. This largely stops after the occupation of Mapuche territory. And they start to negotiate, especially in the 20th century, in many cases by working within the state apparatus. So, and in the early 19th century, they're very much outside the state apparatus. Also, to what end or with what aim were they negotiating? This also changed. No, so in the early 19th century, it's to hold on to their territory, to stop foreigners intruding into their territory, to secure trade agreements, to have a say in which military officials are appointed in the frontier region, to validate their cultural customs, the continued use of Mapuzungun. In the late 19th century, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, Mapuche political leaders are, or not just political leaders either, but enter into negotiations in order to try to recover lands that they've lost, in order to try and reinstate or reinvigorate Mapuzungun as a living language, for example. So there's many changes, but I think that the fact of the Mapuche negotiating as individuals who identify as part of a collective that's distinct from, but not necessarily antagonistic to Chilean society, I think that's a continuing reality from the early 19th century through to today.